The fluorescent lights above me flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting harsh shadows across the sterile hospital room. I blinked slowly, my vision still foggy from the anesthesia, trying to piece together where I was and why my abdomen felt like it had been hit by a freight train. The antiseptic smell filled my nostrils, mixing with the faint scent of coffee from somewhere down the hallway. "Miss Thompson? How are you feeling?" A warm voice cut through the haze. I turned my head slightly to see a middle-aged Hispanic man in a white coat standing beside my bed, his kind brown eyes studying me with professional concern. The name tag read, Dr. Martinez. "Like I got run over by a CTA bus," I croaked, my throat dry as sandpaper. The taste of metal lingered in my mouth, and I could feel the IV tube taped to my left hand, the cool liquid slowly dripping into my veins. Dr. Martinez chuckled softly, making a note on his clipboard. "That's normal after appendix surgery. You came in just in time. Another few hours and we would have been dealing with a much more serious situation." He pulled up a chair beside my bed, his movements deliberate and calming. "The procedure went perfectly. You should be able to go home tomorrow morning if everything continues to look good." I nodded weakly, trying to sit up slightly but wincing as the pain shot through my side. The hospital gown felt scratchy against my skin, and I could feel the bandages pulling tight across my lower abdomen. Through the window, I could see the Chicago skyline in the distance, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the city I'd called home for 5 years. "The nurse will be in shortly to check on you," Dr. Martinez continued, his pen tapping against the clipboard. "Is there anything you need right now? Any questions about your recovery?" I shook my head, already mentally preparing for the next few days. I'd need to call Jake, my boss at the design firm, to let him know I'd be out for a week. My laptop was at home, so I could probably manage some work from bed if needed. The rent was due next week, and I had that client presentation on Friday that I'd need to reschedule. Dr. Martinez stood up, tucking his pen into his coat pocket, but then paused. He looked around the empty room, taking in the single visitor's chair that remained untouched, the absence of flowers or get-well cards on the bedside table. His expression shifted slightly, becoming more curious than clinical. "Miss Thompson," he said gently, settling back into the chair, "I have to ask, why didn't your family come for you?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, my mind suddenly sharp despite the lingering effects of the medication. Family. The word felt foreign on my tongue, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. I don't really have family," I said finally, the words coming out more defensively than I intended. "I mean, I have parents, but we don't really talk, and I don't have siblings or anything like that." Dr. Martinez's eyebrows furrowed slightly. "What about friends? A boyfriend? Someone who could be here with you during recovery?" I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. Here I was, 25 years old, and I couldn't name a single person who would drop everything to sit in a hospital room with me. My friends from college had scattered across the country after graduation, and the friendships I'd tried to build in Chicago had always remained surface level. I was good at keeping people at arm's length. It was safer that way. "I'm pretty independent," I said, forcing a smile that I knew didn't reach my eyes. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I don't really need anyone." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Dr. Martinez studied me with those kind eyes, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. He'd probably seen plenty of patients like me over the years. People who showed up to medical emergencies alone, who listed no emergency contacts, who faced their vulnerabilities in isolation. "Miss Thompson," he said carefully, "independence is admirable, but recovery from surgery, even a routine one like yours, goes much smoother when you have support. Someone to help with groceries, to make sure you're taking your medications, to drive you to follow-up appointments." I wanted to argue, to insist that I'd managed just fine for years without anyone's help. But lying in that hospital bed, feeling more vulnerable than I had in months, the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself thinking about the past 24 hours, how I'd driven myself to the emergency room while doubled over in pain, how I'd signed all the consent forms with shaking hands, how I'd faced the terrifying prospect of surgery completely alone. "I'll be fine," I said quietly, but even to my own ears, it sounded hollow. Dr. Martinez made another note on his clipboard, then looked at me with something that might have been concern or pity. I couldn't tell which was worse. "The nurse will give you discharge instructions tomorrow, including some resources for post-surgical support if you need them. Please don't hesitate to call if you have any concerns." After he left, I lay there staring at the ceiling, his question echoing in my mind. Why didn't your family come for you? The answer was more complicated than I'd let on, involving years of disappointment, harsh words, and the gradual realization that some relationships cause more pain than they heal. Outside my window, the city continued its relentless pace. Millions of people going about their lives, connected to each other in ways I'd convinced myself I didn't need. But for the first time in years, I wondered if maybe I'd been wrong. The next morning arrived with the familiar sounds of a hospital coming to life, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum, the distant beeping of machines, and the muffled conversations of medical staff beginning their shifts. I'd barely slept, partly from the discomfort of my incision, and partly from Dr. Martinez's question, replaying in my mind like a broken record. A young nurse with curly red hair and kind green eyes knocked softly on my doorframe. "Good morning, Miss Thompson. I'm Sarah, and I'll be helping you get ready for discharge today." She wheeled in a small cart filled with paperwork and medication bottles, her scrubs decorated with tiny cartoon cats that made me smile despite myself. "How are you feeling this morning?" she asked, checking my vitals with practiced efficiency. Her touch was gentle as she examined my bandages, and I found myself relaxing slightly under her care. "Sore, but better than yesterday," I admitted, trying to sit up straighter. The pain was more manageable now, a dull ache instead of the sharp stabbing I'd experienced before surgery. Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what we want to hear. Your incision looks great, and your vital signs are all normal. Dr. Martinez cleared you for discharge." She handed me a thick packet of papers. "These are your discharge instructions, medication schedule, and follow-up appointment information. Do you have someone who can help you understand all this?" There it was again, the assumption that I had people in my life who cared enough to help navigate post-surgical recovery. I took the papers, scanning through the detailed instructions about wound care, activity restrictions, and warning signs to watch for. "I'll manage," I said, though the sheer volume of information felt overwhelming. "When do I need to come back?" "In 1 week for a follow-up with Dr. Martinez, and then again in 2 weeks to have your stitches removed." Sarah sat down in the visitor's chair, her expression becoming more serious. "Miss Thompson, I have to ask, do you have reliable transportation for these appointments? And someone who can help you at home for the first few days?" I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I can take an Uber to the appointments, and I live alone, but I'll be fine. I'm pretty self-sufficient." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then reached into her cart and pulled out a business card. "This is for our patient support services. They can help arrange transportation and even some light housekeeping assistance if you need it. There's no shame in accepting help, especially when you're recovering." I took the card, though I had no intention of using it. The idea of strangers in my apartment, seeing how I lived, felt invasive. I'd rather struggle through recovery alone than expose myself to that kind of vulnerability. An hour later, I was dressed in the same clothes I'd worn to the emergency room, wrinkled jeans and a Northwestern University sweatshirt that smelled faintly of the antiseptic soap I'd used to scrub my hands before surgery. My discharge paperwork was complete, and I'd reluctantly accepted the wheelchair ride to the hospital entrance that Sarah insisted was policy. Standing on the sidewalk outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital, I realized I faced my first real challenge. I'd taken an ambulance to get here, and now I needed to figure out how to get home to my Lincoln Park apartment. The October air was crisp, and I could smell the earthy scent of fallen leaves mixed with the exhaust from the busy street. I pulled out my phone to call an Uber, but my hands were shaking slightly. Whether from the medication or anxiety, I wasn't sure. The app showed a 7-minute wait time, and I found myself looking around nervously at the bustling hospital entrance. Families were arriving for visiting hours. Medical staff were grabbing coffee from the vendor cart, and I stood there feeling utterly alone in the middle of all that activity. "Miss Thompson?" I turned to see a familiar face. Jake Morrison, my boss from the design firm. He was hurrying toward me, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his tie slightly askew. "Thank God you're okay. I got your message about the surgery and came as soon as I could." I stared at him in shock. Jake was in his early 40s with prematurely gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like the college professor he'd been before starting his own design company. We had a good working relationship, but I'd never expected him to actually show up at the hospital. "Jake, you didn't have to come," I said, clutching my discharge papers tighter. "I'm fine, really. Just need to get home and rest." He looked at me with the same expression I'd seen on Dr. Martinez's face, concern mixed with something that might have been disappointment. "Nick, you had surgery, of course I came." He gestured toward the parking garage. "Come on, I'm driving you home, and don't even think about arguing with me." The ride to my apartment was quiet except for the soft jazz playing on Jake's radio and the distant hum of Chicago traffic. I stared out the window at the familiar neighborhoods passing by, trying to process the strange feeling of being taken care of. When had I become so unused to simple acts of kindness? "You know," Jake said as we stopped at a red light, "when I got your voicemail, I realized I don't know much about your life outside of work. No emergency contacts in your file except for your parents in Ohio." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. I like to keep work and personal life separate. Nick, he said gently, having people who care about you isn't a weakness. It's human. The light turned green and he continued driving toward my building. I know you're incredibly talented and independent, but everyone needs support sometimes. As we pulled up to my building on North Cleveland Avenue, I could see Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor, tending to her small garden in front of the building. She looked up as Jake helped me out of the car, her weathered face creasing with concern when she noticed how carefully I was moving. "Nikki!" she called out, using the nickname she'd given me despite my protests. "What happened to you?" Before I could answer, she was hurrying over, her small hands fluttering around me like a worried bird. Mrs. Chen was in her 70s, with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun and clothes that somehow always looked freshly pressed despite her constant gardening. "I had my appendix out," I said, touched by her obvious concern. "I'm fine, just need to rest." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. "Surgery? And you're just coming home now? Where was your family?" There it was again, that question that seemed to follow me everywhere. I saw Jake and Mrs. Chen exchange a look, and I felt like I was being studied under a microscope. "I don't really have family here," I said quietly, the words feeling heavier each time I said them. Mrs. Chen made a tutting sound and shook her head. "Nonsense. You have us. Jake, help her upstairs. I'll make soup." As Jake supported my arm and we slowly climbed the 3 flights to my apartment, I found myself overwhelmed by these small acts of kindness from people I'd kept at arm's length for years. Maybe Dr. Martinez had been right. Maybe independence didn't have to mean isolation. My apartment felt different when I walked through the door. Smaller somehow, as if seeing it through Jake's eyes made me notice how sparse it really was. The living room held only the essentials: a gray couch I'd bought on sale, a coffee table covered with design magazines, and my workstation set up in the corner. No family photos, no personal mementos, just the clean, impersonal space I'd convinced myself was sophisticated. "Nice place," Jake said, though I could tell he was being polite. He helped me settle onto the couch, arranging the throw pillows behind my back. "Do you have everything you need? Food? Medications?" I gestured toward the kitchen, which was visible from the living room in my studio-style apartment. "I've got some cereal and instant coffee. I'll order takeout when I get hungry." The truth was, I hadn't thought much about how I'd manage meals while recovering. My usual routine involved grabbing lunch near the office and picking up dinner on my way home. Jake frowned, opening my nearly empty refrigerator. "Nick, you can't survive on cereal and Chinese takeout while you're recovering from surgery. Your body needs proper nutrition to heal." Before I could protest, there was a soft knock at my door. Jake opened it to reveal Mrs. Chen holding a large pot that smelled like heaven, rich chicken broth with hints of ginger and garlic. "Nikki needs real food," she announced, bustling into my apartment with the confidence of someone who'd appointed herself my caretaker. "This is my grandmother's recipe: chicken soup with ginger and scallions. Very good for healing." She set the pot on my small stovetop and began opening cabinets, tutting disapprovingly at my meager collection of dishes. "You don't have proper bowls. How do you eat soup from these tiny things?" She held up one of my small cereal bowls, shaking her head. "Mrs. Chen, you really didn't need to do this," I said, though the smell of her soup was making my mouth water. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until that moment. "Of course I did," she said matter-of-factly, ladling soup into one of my inadequate bowls. "You're sick, you're alone, you need help. This is what neighbors do." Jake watched this exchange with interest, and I caught him smiling slightly. "Mrs. Chen is right," he said, "and I'm going to run to the grocery store to get you some proper food for the next few days. What do you usually eat?" The question stumped me. What did I usually eat? Salads from the deli near work, frozen dinners heated up while I worked late, coffee that substituted for breakfast more often than I cared to admit. I'd become so focused on efficiency that I'd forgotten how to nourish myself properly. I'm not really much of a cook," I admitted, feeling embarrassed by yet another way I'd failed to create a normal adult life. Mrs. Chen made another disapproving sound. "No wonder you're so thin. After you heal, I teach you to cook proper meals. For now, you eat soup and rest." She settled into my only chair, a sleek black thing that looked modern but was actually quite uncomfortable. "Tell me about your family," she said, her dark eyes studying me with the intensity of someone who'd raised 3 children and could read people like books. I shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "There's not much to tell. My parents live in Ohio. We don't really talk." "Why not?" Mrs. Chen asked, as if it were the most natural question in the world. I took a careful sip of soup, buying time. The warmth spread through my chest, and I realized it had been years since someone had made me homemade food. We had a falling out when I moved to Chicago. They wanted me to stay in our small town, maybe teach art at the high school, get married to someone from church. I wanted something different. Jake returned from the grocery store with several bags of food. Real food, not the processed convenience items I usually survived on. He'd bought ingredients for simple meals, fresh bread, eggs, produce, and even some flowers that he arranged in an empty mason jar I'd been using as a pencil holder. "Your parents wanted you to be safe," Mrs. Chen said, continuing our conversation as if Jake had never left. "Parents always want their children to be safe, but safety and happiness are not always the same thing." I nodded, thinking about my last conversation with my mother 3 months ago. She'd called to tell me that my high school boyfriend had gotten married, adding pointedly that I could have been the bride if I'd made different choices. The conversation had ended with her saying I was being selfish and me hanging up, both of us hurt and stubborn. I told them I was having surgery, I said quietly. Left a voicemail. They never called back. The silence that followed was heavy. Jake was putting groceries away in my kitchen, but I could tell he was listening. Mrs. Chen reached over and patted my hand with her small, calloused one. "Sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the family we're born into," she said. "My son lives in California now. He calls every Sunday. But when I was sick last year, it was my neighbors who brought me soup, who drove me to doctor appointments. Blood is not always thicker than kindness." Her words hit me unexpectedly hard. I'd spent so many years building walls, protecting myself from disappointment, that I'd forgotten how to let people in. But here were Jake and Mrs. Chen, two people I'd barely considered friends a day ago, taking care of me without being asked. "I'm not used to this," I admitted, gesturing vaguely at the soup, the groceries, their presence in my apartment. "I've been taking care of myself for so long I forgot how to let other people help." Jake finished organizing my kitchen and sat down on the edge of my coffee table facing me. "Nick, you don't have to do everything alone. I know you're incredibly capable. You're one of the most talented designers I've ever worked with. But being strong doesn't mean never needing anyone." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Smart man. Nikki, you spend too much time alone in this apartment. When you feel better, you come have dinner with me and my husband. He makes excellent dumplings." I felt tears prick at my eyes, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the medication or the exhaustion, or just the overwhelming realization that I'd been living half a life without even knowing it. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. "Both of you. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't repay kindness," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You pass it on. When you're better, you help someone else who needs it. That's how the world works." As the afternoon wore on, Jake helped me set up a comfortable recovery area on my couch with extra pillows and blankets. Mrs. Chen left me with strict instructions to call if I needed anything, and a container of soup large enough to last for days. Before they left, Jake wrote his personal phone number on a sticky note and put it on my refrigerator. "Day or night," he said. "If you need anything, call me." I mean it. After they left, I sat in my apartment that somehow felt warmer and more alive than it had in months. The flowers Jake had bought added color to my neutral space, and the lingering smell of Mrs. Chen's soup made everything feel more like home. For the first time since Dr. Martinez had asked his question, I began to understand that maybe I hadn't been as alone as I thought. 3 days into my recovery, I was going stir-crazy. The pain medication made me drowsy, but I couldn't seem to sleep for more than a few hours at a time. I'd reorganized my design portfolio twice, caught up on every industry blog I could find, and even started sketching ideas for a client project that wasn't due for another month. My apartment felt like a beautiful prison. Sarah, the nurse from the hospital, had called to check on me the day before. When I mentioned feeling restless, she'd laughed and said it was a good sign. It meant I was healing well. But she'd also reminded me about the warning signs to watch for and emphasized the importance of not overdoing it. I was attempting to do some light stretching when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Mom, the first time she'd called since I'd left that voicemail about my surgery. My hand hovered over the phone for several rings before I finally answered. "Nicole?" My mother's voice was tight with worry and something that might have been guilt. "I just got your message. Are you okay?" I sat down heavily on my couch, suddenly exhausted. "Hi, Mom. I'm fine. Surgery went well. I'm recovering at home." "Surgery," she repeated, as if the word was foreign to her. "Your appendix. Why didn't you call us before? We could have come. We could have helped." The question stung, partly because I wasn't sure I knew the answer myself. "I didn't think you'd want to come," I said finally. "We haven't exactly been on speaking terms." The silence stretched between us, filled with years of hurt feelings and stubborn pride. I could hear my father's voice in the background asking who was on the phone and my mother's muffled explanation. "Nicole, of course we would have come. You're our daughter." Her voice cracked slightly. I know things have been difficult between us, but we love you." I felt tears starting to well up, and I pressed my free hand against my incision, using the physical discomfort to ground myself. Mom, the last time we talked, you told me I was being selfish for choosing my career over family, that I was wasting my life in a big city where nobody cared about me. I was angry, she said quietly. I was scared. You're so far away and we never see you, and I worry constantly that something will happen and we won't know. Well, something did happen, I said, surprised by the bitterness in my own voice. And I handled it. I'm handling it. Alone, she said. You're handling it alone. Before I could respond, there was a gentle knock at my door. Through the peephole, I could see Mrs. Chen holding what looked like a casserole dish, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the windy October day. Mom, I have to go, I said. My neighbor is here. Your neighbor? There was surprise in her voice. I thought you said you didn't know anyone in Chicago. Things change, I said, opening the door to let Mrs. Chen in. She immediately began fussing over me, checking to make sure I was taking my medications and eating properly. Nicole, who is that? My mother asked, hearing Mrs. Chen's concerned voice in the background. This is Mrs. Chen. She lives in my building. She's been taking care of me since I got home from the hospital. The silence from my mother was deafening. I could practically hear her processing this information, that strangers in Chicago were doing what she and my father should have been doing. Can I talk to her? My mother asked hesitantly. I looked at Mrs. Chen, who was already nodding with understanding. Mrs. Chen, this is my mother. She'd like to thank you. Mrs. Chen took the phone with the authority of someone who'd been managing family situations for decades. Hello, Mrs. Thompson. Your daughter is very brave, very strong. She's healing well, but she needs people who love her around her right now. I couldn't hear my mother's response, but I could see Mrs. Chen's expression softening. Yes, she is stubborn. Gets that from her parents, I think. She laughed, a sound that somehow managed to cut through years of family tension. No, you don't need to thank me. This is what we do for people we care about. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Mrs. Chen somehow managing to scold, comfort, and educate my mother all at once. When she finally handed the phone back to me, my mother sounded different, smaller, more vulnerable. Nicole, I'm sorry, she said, and I could hear that she was crying. I'm sorry we weren't there. I'm sorry for all the things I said. I was so scared of losing you to that big city that I pushed you away instead. I felt my own tears starting again, and this time, I didn't try to stop them. Mom, I'm sorry too. I was so determined to prove I could do everything myself that I forgot how to let people help me. Can we start over? She asked. I know I can't fix everything with one phone call, but I want to try. Your father and we want to be part of your life again. I looked around my apartment, taking in the evidence of the care I'd been receiving. The soup containers from Mrs. Chen, the flowers from Jake, the grocery list Sarah had helped me make during her follow-up call. Maybe it was time to stop being so afraid of needing people. I'd like that, I said, but it's going to take time. We've both said things. I know, she said quickly. I know, but we have time. And Nicole, next time something happens, anything, you call us first. Promise me. After we hung up, Mrs. Chen sat beside me on the couch, her small frame somehow radiating comfort. Family is complicated, she said simply, but love is stronger than pride, if you let it be. That evening, Jake stopped by after work to check on me. He brought Chinese takeout and insisted on staying to eat with me, claiming he was too tired to cook for himself. I suspected it was really because he was worried about me being alone, but I was grateful for the company. You look better, he said, settling into my uncomfortable chair with a container of lo mein. More like yourself. I told him about the conversation with my mother, and he listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that helped me process my feelings. It struck me that this was the first real conversation I'd had with Jake outside of work topics, and I realized I'd been missing out on what could have been a genuine friendship. It's funny, I said, picking at my orange chicken. I spent so much energy trying to prove I didn't need anyone that I forgot how good it feels to be cared about. Jake nodded. I did the same thing when I first moved to Chicago. I was so focused on building the business that I forgot to build relationships. It took getting really sick a few years ago to realize that success doesn't mean much if you don't have people to share it with. Is that why you came to the hospital? I asked. Because you remembered what it felt like to be alone? He considered this. Partly. But also because I realized I care about you, Nick. Not just as an employee, but as a person. You've been working for me for 2 years, and I barely knew anything about your life outside the office. That's on me. As we finished our meal, I felt something shifting inside me. The walls I'd built around myself were beginning to crumble, and instead of feeling vulnerable, I felt lighter. Maybe Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe love really was stronger than pride, and maybe family was about more than just blood relations. That night, I slept better than I had in months, surrounded by the evidence that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. And for the first time in years, that didn't scare me. 2 weeks after my surgery, I sat in Dr. Martinez's office for my final follow-up appointment. The harsh fluorescent lights that had seemed so intimidating during my hospital stay now felt familiar and oddly comforting. My incision had healed beautifully, leaving only a small scar that Dr. Martinez assured me would fade with time. "You've recovered remarkably well," he said, reviewing my chart with satisfaction. "How are you feeling? Any lingering pain or discomfort?" "Much better," I said, and meant it. "I'm back to work part-time, and I can walk up the stairs to my apartment without getting winded." Dr. Martinez nodded, making notes. "And how about support? Are you managing okay at home?" The question that had once felt like an accusation now made me smile. "Actually, I have more support than I know what to do with. My neighbor has been bringing me dinner every other day. My boss has been checking on me constantly, and my parents are flying in from Ohio next weekend." He looked up from his chart, eyebrows raised with interest. "That's wonderful to hear. You know, when I asked you that question 2 weeks ago, I was concerned. Not just about your physical recovery, but about your emotional well-being. Isolation can be just as harmful as any medical condition." I thought about that conversation in my hospital room, how his simple question had forced me to confront the walls I'd built around myself. You were right to be concerned. I didn't realize how alone I'd become until someone pointed it out. "And now?" he asked. I considered the question. Now I'm learning that needing people doesn't make me weak. It makes me human. After my appointment, I walked slowly through downtown Chicago, taking in the autumn colors that had emerged while I was recovering. The city felt different now, not like a place where I was hiding from my past, but like a place where I was building a future. I had plans to meet Sarah for coffee later that week, and Mrs. Chen had promised to teach me how to make dumplings once I was fully recovered. When I arrived at my building, I found my parents' car parked outside, a week early. My heart jumped with a mixture of panic and excitement. I wasn't ready, hadn't prepared what I wanted to say, hadn't figured out how to bridge the gap that had grown between us over the years. I found them in the lobby talking with Mrs. Chen, who was gesturing animatedly as she explained something. My mother looked older than I remembered, her blonde hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Nicole!" She rushed toward me, stopping just short of a hug, as if unsure whether physical affection was welcome. "You look wonderful. Mrs. Chen has been telling us how brave you've been." My father hung back slightly, his tall frame somehow diminished by uncertainty. He'd always been a man of few words, expressing love through actions rather than speech. "Sweetheart," he said simply, and the nickname he'd used throughout my childhood broke something loose in my chest. "You're early," I said, stating the obvious because I didn't know what else to say. "We couldn't wait," my mother admitted. "After talking to Mrs. Chen and hearing about everything you've been through, we should have been here from the beginning." Mrs. Chen, who had been watching this reunion with the satisfied expression of someone who'd orchestrated it perfectly, stepped forward. "Your parents are lovely people," she said to me. "Very worried about you, very proud of you. I invited them for dinner tonight. I'm making my famous dumplings." The next few hours passed in a blur of awkward conversations and tentative steps toward reconciliation. My parents marveled at my apartment, praised my design work, and asked careful questions about my life in Chicago. It wasn't perfect. There were still underlying tensions and unresolved issues, but it was a start. That evening, Mrs. Chen's small apartment was filled with the sounds of a family learning to be together again. Her husband, a quiet man who spoke broken English but communicated beautifully through his cooking, had indeed made excellent dumplings. Jake had joined us, along with Sarah, who had stopped by during her dinner break. "This is nice," my mother said quietly, watching as Mrs. Chen taught my father how to fold dumplings properly. "I'm glad you have people who care about you here." "I'm glad too," I said, realizing how much I meant it. I spent so long thinking I had to choose between independence and connection. I didn't realize I could have both. Sarah, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics, spoke up. "You know, in nursing school, they teach us that healing isn't just about the body. It's about the whole person, physical, emotional, social. You can't truly heal if you're isolated." "Smart girl," Mrs. Chen said approvingly. "This is why I always tell my children, success means nothing if you have no one to share it with." As the evening wound down, my parents prepared to leave for their hotel. My mother hugged me carefully, mindful of my healing incision, and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Nicole. Not just for your success, but for having the courage to let people in." My father, never one for grand gestures, simply handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a framed photo of our family from when I was in college, before the arguments, before the distance, before we'd forgotten how to talk to each other. "For your apartment," he said gruffly, "so you remember you're not alone." After they left, I sat on my couch looking at the photo, thinking about how much had changed in just 2 weeks. My apartment still looked the same, but it felt completely different. The flowers Jake had brought were thriving in their mason jar vase. Mrs. Chen's soup containers were stacked neatly in my refrigerator, and now I had a family photo to remind me of the people who loved me. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Great dinner tonight. Proud of you for taking that leap with your parents. See you at the office tomorrow and no working late doctor's orders." I smiled, typing back, "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." His response came quickly. "That's what friends are for. And Nick, you're never going to have to find out what you do without us again." As I prepared for bed, I thought about Dr. Martinez's question that had started this whole journey. Why didn't your family come for you? The answer had been complicated. Hurt feelings, stubborn pride, and years of building walls instead of bridges. But maybe the better question was, who would come for me now? The answer filled me with warmth. My parents, who were learning to bridge the gap between their fears and my dreams. Jake, who had shown me that professional relationships could bloom into genuine friendships. Mrs. Chen, who had taken one look at my isolated life and decided to adopt me as family. Sarah, who had turned a professional check-in into real concern for my well-being. I had learned that family wasn't just about blood relations, and independence wasn't about doing everything alone. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was admit you needed help, and sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let people love you. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized that Dr. Martinez had been right. Recovery did go much smoother when you had support. But more than that, life went smoother too. I had spent so many years protecting myself from disappointment that I'd forgotten about the possibility of joy. Tomorrow, I would go back to work, continue healing, and keep learning how to be part of a community. But tonight, I fell asleep knowing that I was no longer alone, and that made all the difference.